All right, so, we love diving into these resources that you all share with us.
Yeah, and this one was a real gem.
It was a big one, though.
Hmm.
The New Art and Science of Teaching Writing by Kathy Tuckman Glass and
Robert J. Marzano.
Robert J. Marzano. That's right.
Yeah, you asked us to kind of pull out the big ideas here, the things that can help us understand, what really makes writing instruction effective.
Yeah, and I think this book it's comprehensive, right? It covers
Yep.
feedback. It looks at content, how we teach it, and then even the context of the classroom itself.
Absolutely. And what's really impressive is how much it's grounded in research. It's always coming back to what really moves the needle for student writers.
I noticed that right away that they're really focused on the outcomes for students.
Yeah, and they make this point that great teaching, it's not just about, following a script.
Right.
There's the science, the research-backed strategies, but there's also the art.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's about how teachers take those strategies and they think about their own students and their own subject and they make it work.
Okay, so I like that a lot, the art and science of teaching writing.
Yeah.
So where do they start?
Well, right off the bat, they hit feedback, and the very first thing they emphasize is setting really clear learning goals.
Yeah, okay. So before we even get into giving feedback, we need to make sure students understand what we're looking for.
Exactly, because think about it. If you're a student and you don't know what the target is,
Right.
how can you possibly aim for it?
Yeah, it's like trying to hit a bullseye when you don't even know where the dartboard is.
That's a great analogy. Those learning goals, they act as that dartboard
I like
for
her.
making sure students understand what's expected of them and how they can measure their own progress.
Okay, so we need clear targets, but how do we actually make those targets visible and understandable for students?
That's where they bring in some specific tools, things like proficiency scales and rubrics.
Oh, okay, I've heard of those.
Yeah, so proficiency scales, they typically run from zero point zero all the way up to 4.0,
Okay.
with 3.0 usually representing, at grade level achievement.
Hmm.
But the real power of these scales is how they break down the steps to get there. Instead of just saying write better,
Right.
they lay out a clear progression of, what knowledge and skills look like at each level.
So it's not just this vague idea of, oh, this is a good essay,
Yeah.
but, breaking it down into you are here and this is where you need to go.
Exactly. And then you have rubrics. Like they
Mhm.
give some really detailed ones for things like argumentation and opinion writing.
Okay. Yeah, I think I remember seeing those.
Yeah, figures 1.6 and 1.7 if you want to look those up.
Okay.
But essentially, it's like a checklist that spells out what strong writing looks like in those specific genres.
Okay.
But the key here is that these scales and rubrics, they're not just for grading at the end.
Right.
Teachers are actually teaching the elements within them from day one.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
So students are very clear on the target from the very beginning.
Yeah, because if we wait till the end to pull out the rubric, I feel like that can be a little disheartening.
Oh.
Like, wait, what was I supposed to be doing this whole time?
Exactly. You need that roadmap from the start.
Right. Okay. So we've got clear learning goals.
Mhm.
We've got the tools to make them visible. So then how do we actually measure student progress towards those goals?
Well, that's where assessment comes in, and they're big on what they call formative scores.
Okay. So this is like assessment that happens along the way, not just a final grade.
Precisely think of it as ongoing feedback that helps students figure out, where they stand in relation to those learning goals.
Mm-hmm.
And they give a whole bunch of examples of assessments that can do this, from analyzing writing samples to, creating diagrams, even grammar exercises, all tied back to specific learning targets.
I like that because, we often think of assessment as something that happens at the end.
Yeah.
But really, if you're constantly assessing along the way, it gives you so many opportunities to course correct,
Oh,
to help students, understand where they are.
and to give them the support they need, exactly when they need it.
Okay, so we've talked about setting clear goals and making sure our assessments are aligned. But feedback isn't all about, pointing out areas for improvement.
Oh, for sure. There's also the really important element of celebrating successes.
Right, because we want our students to feel good about their writing, to be motivated to keep going.
Absolutely. And that's where they talk about building pride and nurturing a growth mindset.
Okay, so this connects to Carol Dweck's work.
It does.
Yeah.
It really emphasized the power of praising effort, persistent, specific improvement.
Yeah, instead of just saying, oh, you're so smart.
Exactly. Because, a general well done
Right.
might feel good in the moment, but it doesn't really tell the student what they did well
Right.
or how to do it again.
It's that informational feedback that Hattie and Yates talk about.
That's right. Feedback that actually gives information is so much more valuable than just praise.
Okay, so the book gives some concrete examples of how to celebrate success in meaningful ways.
Yeah, they talk about verbal praise that's specific,
Mm-hmm.
written notes that highlight growth classroom routines, that acknowledge achievements, even school-wide events.
I like that a lot. We've talked about things like, maybe having a writing celebration where students can share their work,
Yeah.
or, even just, putting up student work in the classroom.
Absolutely. Anything that makes them feel proud of what they've accomplished.
Right. Okay, so we've covered feedback in quite a bit of depth.
We have.
Let's move on to the next big area, content,
Okay.
how we actually teach the stuff of writing.
Sounds good.
So part 2 of the book delves into different types of lessons, and they start with direct instruction.
Yes, which is really all about presenting new information clearly and effectively.
Right.
They stress the importance of chunking, breaking down complex content into smaller, more manageable pieces, giving students time to process that information.
Right.
But what really stood out to me was their focus on recording and representing content.
Okay, element 8, they call it.
That's the one, and I think this is a really key insight for you.
Okay, so what exactly does it mean to record and represent content in the context of writing instruction?
It's all about helping students internalize and remember new information through different methods.
Okay.
So summarizing is a big one, but not just, mindless regurgitation.
Right.
It's about identifying the core of what they've learned and expressing it concisely in their own words.
So real critical thinking skill.
Absolutely. And they even give templates to help with this.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Like there's this great example based on the book Wonder
Okay.
in Figure 3.11, and then they have a structure from the important book by Margaret Wise Brown that you can adapt for all sorts of topics and grade levels.
So essentially giving students a framework for pulling out the essential information.
Exactly.
And then they talk about graphic organizers too.
Oh, yeah, those are a staple, right?
Yeah.
Really powerful for visually representing information and how different ideas connect.
Uh-huh. And then academic notebooks.
Oh, yeah, academic notebooks are like a gold mine.
Go.
They go way beyond just regular note-taking. It's like this personalized hub for vocabulary building, grammar writing conventions, even things like MLA and APA formatting.
So it's almost like their own little writer's handbook that they create over time.
Exactly. And the key is that students are constantly revisiting them, revising them, adding to them.
Okay, so it's a living document.
Precisely.
I like that a lot.
And then, of course, they talk about mnemonic devices.
Oh, yeah, like I before E except after C,
That's the one.
or M boy S for coordinating conjunctions.
Exactly. Those memory aids can be so helpful for students.
They can. They really can. And then they also talk about sentence variety.
Yes, they do. They suggest things like sentence scavenger hunts,
Okay.
where students have to find different sentence structures in a text,
So that's fun.
and activities where they combine simple sentences to make more complex ones.
Okay, so that's all about that recording and representing content, making sure that students really internalize the information.
Exactly.
Okay, so after direct instruction, they move on to practicing and deepening lessons.
Right. So this is where students take what they've learned and they start to really solidify their understanding and skills.
Okay, so it's one thing to learn something new, but then you've got to actually practice it.
Exactly. And they make this distinction between practicing procedural knowledge.
Okay, so that's like the skills,
Yeah.
the how-to of writing.
Exactly. And then deepening declarative knowledge.
So that's the facts, the concepts, the information.
Right. So for practicing procedural knowledge, they talk about structured practice sessions
Okay.
where the teacher models the skill first.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's guided practice where students get support.
Right.
And then they look at strong examples of writing to see, what they're aiming for.
Okay, so showing them models. I
Exactly.
really like that example they give in figure 4.2.
Oh, yeah. Where the teacher is sort of thinking aloud as they draft. Like, should I focus on her appearance or her personality first? What details would make this character believable?
It's so helpful to make that internal process visible for students.
Oh, absolutely. Because so much of writing happens in our heads.
Right.
And then they have those guided practice activities where students might, critique and revise drafts together. And that collaborative learning is so valuable.
It is. And then, looking at strong student examples and even published writing.
Right, giving them real-world models to aspire to.
Right. Okay, so how about deepening declarative knowledge?
So here the focus is on examining the relationships between ideas,
Okay.
and particularly looking at similarities and differences.
Okay.
So they suggest things like compare-contrast charts, summary tables, Venn diagrams, T-charts,
Right.
all those good graphic organizers.
Yeah, they're so useful for visually representing how things connect.
Absolutely. And then there's this really cool example of a Diamante poem in Figure 4.5.
Oh, I love Diamante poems.
It's a really creative way to highlight contrasting characteristics.
I like that.
And then they talk about matching activities, where you might match causes and effects,
Right.
or sentences with the correct punctuation words, with their synonyms, thesis statements, with the type of claim they're making.
So really helping them see those connections.
Exactly. And then sorting activities,
Yep.
where they might categorize text excerpts based on things like characterization or author's purpose or text structure.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, figures 4.6 and 4.7 have some good examples.
Okay.
And then they have this figure 4.10 that shows thesis statements and aligned topic sentences
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
to help them see how those main ideas are developed and connected.
Right. Okay, so we've deepened our understanding. Now it's time to apply that knowledge.
Exactly. So this is the knowledge application lessons where students take what they've learned and they use it in new and more complex situations.
Right. Okay.
So they have this element called engaging students in cognitively complex tasks.
Element 12.
That's right. And these tasks, they really require students to think deeply and apply their knowledge in original ways.
Okay, so not just remembering information, but actually doing something with it.
Exactly. So they give examples like experimental inquiry tasks.
Okay.
Where students might use the scientific method
Right.
or engage in historical inquiry.
Yeah.
They even mention the Stanford History Education Group as a resource.
Oh, yeah, that's a great resource.
And then there are decision-making tasks,
Okay.
where students explore different choices characters could make.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then they have to think about the consequences of those choices.
I like that because it really gets them thinking about, cause and effect.
Absolutely, and how those decisions shape the plot and the character.
Right. And then they talk about student design tasks.
Yes, they do. They mention the Literacy Design Collaborative, or LDC,
Okay.
which has all these task templates that are really challenging.
Okay.
And they integrate reading and writing across different subject areas.
So very cross-curricular.
Exactly, and Figure 5.2 gives some examples.
Okay.
And you can actually adjust the demands of the task
Okay.
to make it more or less complex.
You can differentiate based on student needs.
Exactly, but the important thing is that these tasks, they really push students to go beyond just remembering. They have to actively work with the information.
Okay, so we've got these cognitively complex tasks, but students also need support.
Oh, absolutely. They can't just be thrown into the deep end.
Right.
So Element 13 is all about equipping students with what they need,
Okay.
whether it's technology for research or helpful handouts or even explicit instruction on how to do research effectively.
Yeah, because sometimes we assume students know how to do these things.
Exactly. We have to
Yeah.
make sure they have the tools and the skills.
Right. And of course, throughout all of this, feedback is essential.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It has to be actionable, user-friendly, timely, ongoing, consistent.
So not just a grade at the end, but, those little nudges along the way. Okay, so speaking of applying knowledge, a core part of that is being able to articulate your own ideas and support them effectively.
Absolutely. And that brings us to generating and defending claims.
Element 14.
Yes, and this is where we see that progression from just expressing opinions in the early grades
Uh-huh.
to building formal arguments in middle and high school.
Right. Okay.
So they lay out the structure of an argument,
Okay.
identifying the claim, the grounds, the backing.
So the claim is like your main point.
Exactly. And the grounds are the reasons why you believe that claim.
Okay.
And the backing is the evidence that supports those reasons.
Okay, so like facts and statistics and examples.
That's right. And they have these really helpful diagrams in figures 5.0 and 5.11
Okay.
that show how all these pieces fit together.
And then they break down different types of claims too.
Yes, they do. They have factual claims, definitional claims, claims of value, claims of policy or solution, and cause and effect claims.
Wow, that's a lot of claims.
It is, but they give clear examples for each type.
Okay, that's helpful.
And they also explain, the importance of generating qualifiers.
Right, because, it's not always black and white.
Exactly.
You need those shades of gray.
And then addressing counter-arguments.
Right,
Because a strong argument acknowledges the other side.
absolutely. And they even provide sentence starters.
They do in Figure 5.2
Okay,
to help students incorporate those elements into their writing.
that's helpful because sometimes I think students, they know what a counter argument is, but they don't really know how to write one.
Right. They need those sentence frames to get them started.
Exactly. And then they wrap up this section by by talking about having students formally present their claims.
Yes, whether it's through oral presentations or publishing their work or even, creating a video.
So giving them a real audience for their ideas.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a lot to cover on content, but there's even more in part 2.
They have a whole chapter on strategies that can be used in all types of lessons.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
helpful. So these are like the foundational techniques that we can weave throughout our teaching.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And one key element here is reviewing content.
Element 17.
That's the one. And they talk about a variety of ways to revisit material,
Okay, like what?
like using bell ringers or sponge activities at the beginning of class.
Right, those quick little warm-up activities.
Exactly.
Really?
And they give tons of examples, from sentence construction to vocabulary to working with diagrams.
Okay.
And then they have, what do you think, round tables?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, to get students thinking about what they already know.
And KWL charts.
Yes, the classic KWL chart.
Well, I want to know what I learned.
That's it.
Those are really useful.
And then pre-assessments
Okay.
to gauge where students are starting from.
Do it before you even begin a unit.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that a lot. And then they talk about highlighting critical information.
Element 16.
Right, so how do we help students focus on the most important stuff?
Well, they suggest using things like advanced organizers, graphic organizers, highlighting text note-taking strategies, visual aids.
So lots of different ways to make that information stand out.
Exactly. And they have this great example of the 4 T's of paragraphing.
Okay, what are those?
Topic, time, territory, talker.
Okay.
And they have visuals for this in figures 6.7 and 6.8.
Right.
And it really helps students remember the key elements of a well-structured paragraph.
I like that a lot. I'm going to have to look those up.
And then they explain the close procedure.
Okay, remind me what that is.
So it's where you leave blanks in a text,
Oh, right.
and students have to fill them in.
Okay.
It's a good way to check for comprehension.
And then they have give one, get one.
Oh, yeah, where students share information with each other.
Right.
It's a great way to get them talking and collaborating.
I like that. Okay.
Yeah,
So we've highlighted, now it's time to revise.
exactly. Revising knowledge.
Element 18.
That's right. And this is all about giving students opportunities to actually change and add to their understanding.
Okay, so not just, writing something once and then it's done.
Exactly. Revision is key. So they emphasize using those academic notebooks again.
All right.
And peer feedback is really important here,
Yeah.
giving students a chance to get feedback from their classmates.
Mm-hmm.
And then they talk about using visual cues like proofreading marks.
Right, so those little symbols that we use to indicate errors.
Exactly. And they have a table of those in table 6.1.
Okay.
And then writing tools like revision checklists,
Mhm.
figures 6.13, 6.14, and 6.15 have some examples.
Okay, so giving them that structure for revision.
Exactly, because sometimes students, they don't know where to start with a revision.
Right, they just look at it, they're like, I don't know what to change.
Right, so those checklists can be really helpful.
Okay, and then they talk about reflecting on learning.
Element 19.
So thinking about their own thinking.
Exactly, metacognition.
Right.
And they suggest using reflective journals
Okay.
and quick exit slips at the end of class
Okay.
to get students to think about what they've learned and what they still need to work on.
And then assigning purposeful homework.
Element 20.
Right, because homework shouldn't just be busy work.
Exactly. It should have a clear purpose.
Right.
And they talk about this interesting strategy of parent-assessed homework,
Oh, wow.
where parents actually use revision checklists to give feedback.
So getting parents involved in the process.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
It is. And then they have elaborating on information,
Element 21.
which is all about encouraging deeper thinking.
Okay.
So they connect this to something called elaborative interrogation.
Okay. I've never heard of that.
It's basically asking those why and how questions.
Oh, right, to get students to really explain their thinking.
Exactly. And then finally, they talk about organizing students to interact.
Element 22.
So this is all about using collaboration as a tool for learning.
Right.
And they highlight things like fishbowl demonstrations,
Okay.
where students model effective peer feedback for the class.
So that's a good one.
And then think, pair, share, or think, pair, square.
Right.
And using effective peer response groups.
So lots of ways to get students talking and working together.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was a whirlwind tour of part 2.
It was.
So much good stuff in there.
So much.
Okay, so part 3 shifts gears a bit,
It does.
and it focuses on context.
Yes, specifically student engagement and the classroom environment.
Right, because, you can have the best content in the world, but if students aren't engaged,
It's not going to matter.
it's not going to matter at all.
So they really dive into a whole range of strategies to capture and hold students' interest.
Right, and the first element they discuss is increasing response rates.
Element 24.
So getting every student involved.
Exactly. And they highlight the use of simple hand signals.
Oh, like thumbs up, thumbs down.
That's it. Or using
Right.
finger signals to indicate a number.
Right. Or, we've done things like fist to five,
Yeah.
where, 5 fingers means I completely understand,
Like exactly.
and a fist means I'm totally lost.
Right. And they have a nice little chart of these in figure 7.3.
Okay.
And they also mention response cards. Oh, yeah.
Where every student holds up a card with their answer.
So you get that whole class participation.
Exactly.
Okay. And then they talk about using physical movement.
Element 25.
So getting those bodies moving.
Exactly. Because, sometimes students just need to get out of their seats.
Right.
So they suggest things like having students create body representations to illustrate concepts.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, or engaging in drama-related activities.
Okay. Like what?
Like they could act out scenes from a text they're analyzing.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah. Or they could create human graphic organizers
Oh, I like that.
where their bodies actually represent different parts of a concept or a sequence of events.
So like a living, breathing graphic organizer.
Exactly. And they have an example of a Tableau assignment
Right.
in figure 7.5.
Okay.
These kinesthetic activities can really help students remember what they're learning.
Absolutely. And then they talk about maintaining a lively pace.
Element 26.
So keeping the energy up in the classroom.
That's right. And they talk about structuring lessons with, good momentum.
Right. And using motivational hooks.
Okay, so like what kind of things?
Oh, they could be interesting stories. Short video clips, surprising headlines, anything to really grab students' attention right from the start and keep them engaged.
So like starting with a really good story.
Exactly. Or a thought-provoking question.
Right.
They even give examples like using Storyline Online to engage with stories, or using multi-sensory bags filled with objects related to a topic.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, to really spark their imagination.
And then, of course, the teacher's own energy and enthusiasm is so important.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
A teacher's passion can really be contagious.
It really can. So how do they suggest demonstrating that intensity and enthusiasm?
Element 27.
Okay.
Well, they talk about sharing personal stories related to writing.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, bringing in your own experiences, using engaging video clips.
Okay.
They mention resources like PBS Learning Media and the USC Shoah Foundation.
Okay.
And even sharing anecdotes about famous authors' early rejections.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, to help students see that, even the most successful writers face challenges.
Right. It's that growth mindset again.
Exactly.
Okay. And then they talk about presenting unusual information.
Element 28.
So those little surprising facts?
Yes, those little nuggets of information that make students go, oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Right.
So like they give an example about fascinating facts about owls when you're teaching descriptive writing.
Okay.
And then they talk about inviting guest speakers.
Oh, yeah, that's always a good one.
Yeah, to bring in those real-world connections.
Absolutely. And then they briefly touch on using friendly controversy.
Element 29.
Okay, so getting students to debate different viewpoints.
Exactly, in a respectful way, of course.
Right.
And they mention using Venn diagrams to compare and contrast opposing perspectives.
So helping students see the nuances of different arguments.
Exactly.
Okay. And then who doesn't love a good game?
Element 30, academic games.
Yes.
They're a fun way to review content and reinforce learning. And they describe games like, what is the question?
Oh, like Jeopardy.
Exactly.
I love Jeopardy.
And which one doesn't belong?
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah. And they give examples in figure 7.11
Okay.
and even variations for younger students.
Oh, you can adapt it for different grade levels.
Exactly.
Okay. And then they talk about the importance of making personal connections.
Element 31, providing opportunities for students to talk about themselves.
Oh, yeah, because students are more engaged when they can see the relevance to their own lives.
Absolutely. So they talk about making informal linkages during class discussions
Okay.
by asking questions that relate to students' experiences or the content or overarching themes or even problem-solving scenarios.
Okay, so making those connections explicit.
Exactly. And then they also suggest encouraging students to participate in writing contests.
Oh, yeah.
And they even provide a list of examples with website links.
Okay, that's helpful.
And then finally, they talk about motivating and inspiring students,
Element 32.
which is really the ultimate goal of all these engagement strategies.
Right.
Right? Foster that intrinsic motivation.
Right, because we don't want students to just be doing things because they have to.
Exactly. We want them to be excited about writing. So
Right.
they talk about possible selves activities.
Okay, what are those?
So it's where students explore potential future careers related to writing.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then they mention using gratitude journals
Okay.
to cultivate a more positive and engaged mindset.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on engagement.
We have.
Now let's move on to the last part of the book,
Okay.
which focuses on the classroom environment and then on developing expertise.
Right. So creating that physical and emotional space that supports student writers.
Exactly.
So they talk about displaying student work.
Right, making students feel valued and proud.
Exactly. And then the physical organization of the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
having areas for group work, individual conferences, making sure materials and technology are accessible.
Right.
And then they suggest using opinion questionnaires to get a sense of students' perspectives and preferences.
So really getting to know your students.
Absolutely. And then being familiar with their cultures and even incorporating elements of popular culture.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, to make the learning more relevant and engaging.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then the very last chapter focuses on teachers themselves.
It does.
How we can continue to grow and develop our expertise.
Yes. Because, we're all lifelong learners.
Right.
So they emphasize that becoming an expert teacher, it's an ongoing journey.
Yeah.
And they outline 4 key steps.
Okay, what are those?
First, you do a self-audit
Okay.
to identify areas for growth.
Right.
Then you select specific goals and strategies to focus on.
Okay.
Then you engage in deliberate practice of those strategies.
Right.
And you track your progress.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, you continuously reflect on your practice and you plan for further improvement.
Okay, so it's that cycle of continuous improvement.
Exactly. And they even give a teacher's example related to repeating the most important content to illustrate how the cycle might look in action.
And they have that great figure in the appendix.
Is your A1.
Yeah, that kind of summarizes the whole framework.
It does. A really nice visual.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the new art and science of teaching writing,
Yeah.
it's clear that this book is a treasure trove of strategies.
It is. It's so comprehensive and research-based. And
Right.
it covers everything from feedback to content to classroom environment.
And it's all focused on that ultimate goal of improving student writing.
Absolutely.
So as you, our listener, continue to think about this resource,
Yeah.
I encourage you to think about which of these elements really resonates with you
Mm-hmm.
and your teaching context and the students that you work with.
Because there's something in here for everyone.
Absolutely. And I think a really good question to reflect on
Yeah.
is if you could only implement one of these strategies consistently,
Yeah.
which one do you think would have the biggest impact on your students' writing?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's something to really think about.
And it might even change from year to year.
It might, depending on, your students and your curriculum and your own goals as a teacher.
Exactly. So keep exploring, keep learning, keep refining your craft.
And keep sharing those amazing resources with us.
We love hearing from you.
We do. All right, that's it for this deep dive into the new art and science of teaching writing.
Until next time.
Happy writing, everyone.
Bye.